My name is Khalid, and what I am about to tell you is the burden I have kept hidden inside my chest for years. Because there are some sins that a person does not confess to others first. He confesses them to himself, while fearing the eyes of his own children. This incident is about 22 years old. I was nearly 30 at the time and had been broken by continuous failures. My father's small business had come into my hands, but debts, losses, bad decisions, and people's betrayals had brought me to such a state that even opening the shop shutter felt shameful. At home was my wife, Samina. We had been married for 3 years, and Allah had blessed us with a daughter, Fatima, who was only a few months old at the time. During the day, I would laugh in front of people. At night, I would go to the roof, sit in the darkness, and the same question would circle in my heart. A man works hard, prays, struggles, yet if every door closes, where does he go? During those days, a man came into my life whom people called Hazrat Jai. But he did not look like a saint nor a beggar, just a silent man with sharp eyes who spoke little and observed a lot. He listened to my troubles. Then, after a long silence, he said, "If you want the door of your destiny to open, sometimes you have to go to a place where all doors are already closed." I asked where. He said only one word, "the cemetery." I can never forget the night I first went with him to the old cemetery on the edge of the city. It was a winter night. The fog was so thick that even the light of a lantern was swallowed in it. The cemetery was on the outskirts, where even during the day people would quickly recite a prayer and leave, and at night even the dogs changed their route. Under the neem and acacia trees, rows of graves stretched out as if the earth had placed hundreds of secrets on its chest in the form of mounds. Hazrat Jai did not explain any details to me, nor do I wish to describe any method here. I will only say that that night something was recited there, something was placed, something was asked for, and above all, a promise was taken. At first, I thought it was all a play of my fear and anxiety. But when the cemetery air suddenly became completely still, when the sound of the distant mosque's call to prayer seemed trapped in the fog, and when Hazrat Jai stood near an old unmarked grave and said to me, "What you are asking for, you will have to give something in return. Say it with your tongue. Time will take the rest." Then the frightened, broken, greedy man inside me overcame my faith and my fear. That night I did not make the promise in very clear words. Perhaps that is why I deceived myself for years. I said, "If my household is set right, if my livelihood opens up, if my child remains safe, then whatever greatest happiness comes into my house, its share will be yours." At that moment, I did not even know what I was saying. I took it as a vague sentence, a slip of a frightened tongue, a foolishness that the morning light would erase. But as soon as those words left my mouth, in that part of the cemetery where no wind was blowing, several dry leaves moved together, and from near the soil of the unmarked grave, such a cold rose that a wave ran from my feet to my head. Hazrat Jai immediately grabbed my arm and said, "Now do not look back." We left the cemetery. I truly did not look back, but I felt the entire way that something was following not our footsteps but our promise. After that, my life began to change. First, an old debt was suddenly repaid. Then goods that had been at a loss were sold at good prices. Within a few years, my condition became such that people started calling me a successful man. I went from a shop to a warehouse, from a warehouse to a small factory. Then I changed houses, bought a car, earned respect. Relatives changed their behavior, and I buried that night inside me not as a mistake, but as an illusion of time. But buried things are not always dead. Sometimes they wait. During this time, my daughter Fatima grew up. She was the light of my eyes, my first child, my prayer, my weakness. I provided her with the best school, the best clothes, the best life. Perhaps also because deep in some corner of my heart, I was always afraid that my earnings might contain some darkness. But in the noise of life, the busyness of business, and the intoxication of success, a person convinces even his own fears that they are baseless. When Fatima's marriage was arranged, that happiness came into our house which every father dreams of. The boy was good, the family respectable, and Fatima was also happy. Samina had been busy with preparations for months. Clothes, jewelry, furniture, dowry, feasts, hall, mehndi, everything was being done with love. But just 10 days before the wedding, a subtle change began in the atmosphere of the house. At first, I thought it was tiredness. Then I thought it was the disorder of a wedding house. But some things were not ordinary. At night, sometimes the smell of wet earth would come from Fatima's room, even though the room was upstairs and the windows were closed. One morning, a light layer of earth was found on her mehndi outfit, as if someone had touched it with a damp hand. Samina scolded that a servant must have placed it in the wrong spot, but when I lifted that earth with my finger, my heart trembled for no reason. It was not ordinary earth. It carried the same cold that I had felt 22 years ago in the soil of that unmarked grave. Then Fatima told me something. She said, "Father, for the past 2 nights I have a dream. In the dream I am sitting as a bride, but the wedding procession is not coming. Someone else has come and he says, 'I have come to take my share of happiness.'" I quickly changed the subject, but inside me an old locked door had opened. That same evening, a beggar-like man came to the outside of our house. I was in the courtyard talking to the wedding tent workers. He stood outside the gate and said just one thing, "Remember the promise." I turned to look, and he was standing in the shadow of the gate. His face was not clearly visible. I thought he was a beggar and started taking money from my pocket. But instead of taking the money, he said, "Not money, the share." The note fell from my hand. I walked toward the gate, but the man had already left. The street outside was empty. Only a little wet earth was lying near the gate, even though it had not rained for many days. The night before the wedding was the mehndi ceremony. The house was glowing with lights. Women were singing, the drum was beating, children were making noise, and guests were arriving. But in the midst of all that noise, I kept feeling that in one part of the house, a silence was gathering and settling. The fairy lights outside Fatima's room went off by themselves 3 times. Each time they went off, a smell of wet earth and incense came from inside the room. Once, Samina said that perhaps it was an electrical problem, but I knew it was not electricity. That night, when everyone had fallen asleep from exhaustion, I sat alone downstairs. Near 2:00 a.m., a very faint sound came from upstairs, as if something heavy was being dragged on wood. I slowly climbed the stairs. Fatima's room was closed. There was no sound from inside. I was about to turn back when a dry leaf slid out from under the door, an acacia leaf, the same kind that grew near the old cemetery. The wedding night arrived. Just before the wedding procession was to come, a strange silence suddenly fell over the house. Outside, the band players were present. The women were ready. The guests were seated. But for a moment, I felt as if all the sounds had moved very far away. Fatima was sitting in her room in her bridal dress. Samina and 2 of her sisters were with her. I was downstairs looking after the guests when suddenly there were 3 knocks on the gate. So deliberate, so slow, that the knock felt less like a knock and more like an announcement. A servant went to open the gate. Then he immediately came back, his face pale. He said, "Sir, a man has come. He says, 'Tell the bride's father that I have come to collect the promise.'" The strength drained from my legs. I went to the gate. Outside stood a man. On his head was an old sheet. In his hand was a small bundle of dried flowers. By his feet was wet earth. His face was in darkness, but in his voice was the same cold as the cemetery. He said, "Khalid, happiness has arrived. I have come to take my share." With great difficulty I said, "I never made any promise." He did not laugh. He did not get angry. He just said very calmly, "In the cemetery the tongue belongs to the man, but the memory belongs to the ground. You may forget. The place does not forget." My throat closed. At that same moment a scream came from Fatima's room upstairs. I ran like a madman. When I entered the room, Fatima was sitting, trembling. Samina was next to her. On the floor, from the bridal bed to the door, there were wet, muddy footprints, as if someone had entered barefoot and then left. Fatima said, crying, "Father, just now a woman was whispering near my ear. She said, 'Your father did not place you in happiness. He placed you in a promise.'" Hearing that sentence, my world went dark. The sin I had hidden inside me for years had now reached my daughter's wedding dress. Samina grabbed my arm and asked, "Khalid, what promise?" Her voice was full of fear, but more dangerous than that fear was the doubt that had descended on her face, as if she realized for the first time that this calamity had not come from outside our house. The path had been opened by my own hands years ago. I stood there looking at her for a few moments. Downstairs, the gate was knocked on again. 3 times, perfectly measured, not hurried. Just such patience, as if the thing standing outside the door was certain that those inside would eventually answer. With that knock, a faint sound of bangles came from Fatima's room. At that moment I surrendered. I told Samina everything. That old night, the cemetery, the unmarked grave, that man, and my sentence that I had uttered in my failure, greed, and fear. If my household is set right, if my fortune changes, then from my greatest happiness, a share will belong to that place. Samina's face went completely numb. She did not curse me, she did not scream, she did not cry. Perhaps that was the most terrifying thing for me. She just looked at me. As if, for the first time, something buried in the foundation of the man she had been building a home with had become visible. Then she said very softly, "You did not promise your happiness, Khalid. You opened the door of your house." I was about to answer when another scream came from Fatima. This was not the scream of a bride. It was the scream of that child who used to call her father when she was afraid at night. We both ran upstairs. Fatima was sitting in the middle of the room. Her red dupatta had slipped to one side. The henna on her hands was fresh, but on her right palm, in one spot, the henna had spread by itself into a black stain. It looked as if someone had traced an old mark in the earth with a finger. Samina immediately held her hand, but Fatima looked at me and said in a trembling voice, "Father, just now someone whispered near my ear. He said, 'You cannot hide her. I am your greatest happiness.'" I looked towards the door in panic. The door was closed, but from under it, a thin line of wet earth had come inside, as if someone had stood outside for a long time and, not being allowed in, had left only their presence. At that same moment, in the mirror behind Fatima, a strange thing appeared. It was not the reflection of the room. For a few seconds, the mirror showed the cemetery instead. The neem tree, the fog, and a red cloth placed near an unmarked grave. Then the mirror became normal again. Samina, without wasting any time, removed Fatima's heavy dupatta, took off some of her jewelry and pulled her clothes. Downstairs, mobile phones were ringing continuously, calls from the wedding party, messages from relatives, women's voices all coming at once. But amidst this noise, another sound was also present inside the house. Very faint, coming from far away, as if someone was not speaking from inside a closed room but from inside the walls. Samina immediately covered Fatima's ears with her hands. Then she looked at me, and this time there was not fear in her eyes but a decision. She said, "The bride's departure will not happen today." I panicked and said, "What will people say? The wedding procession is on its way. It is a matter of honor." Samina answered in such a cold tone that I fell silent. She said, "Honor is what you left alone in the cemetery." I came downstairs. The atmosphere of the house had changed. The voices of the guests were there, but they sounded as if they were coming from a distance. The band players were outside the gate, but the beat of the drum would sometimes become loud and then suddenly fade far away, as if someone was pulling the sound toward the cemetery. When I reached the gate, that same man was standing outside. This time in his hand was not a bundle of dried flowers but a small red cloth, exactly like the one I had seen near the grave in the mirror. His face was still in the darkness. He said, "Khalid, people are waiting. Let the happiness come out." I held the latch from inside and said, "Not today." He was silent. Then he said very softly, "What is said in the cemetery is not undone by the shame of the house." His tone had no anger. That was the most terrifying part. He was not trying to frighten me. He was simply reminding me of an old account. At that moment, another car stopped outside the gate. I thought the wedding procession had arrived. Some men's voices came. Someone said, "Khalid Sahib, open the door, it is time." The voice sounded exactly like the groom's father. For a moment I began to open the latch, but from behind, Samina screamed, "Do not open the door." I stopped my hand. I took out my mobile and called the groom's father. He said, "We are still half an hour away, stuck in traffic." The phone nearly fell from my hand. The people standing outside spoke again. "Khalid Sahib, it is getting late. Send the bride out." Their voices came together, but something was wrong with every voice, as if they were all imitating human voices but had forgotten how to breathe. Panic spread inside the house. Some relatives said to open the door. Some women said that Fatima had been struck by the evil eye. Someone was bringing water, someone was calling a doctor. But Samina did not let Fatima come out of the room. She locked the room from inside and said only this: "Until morning comes, do not believe any voice." That night the house endured a strange torment of voices. Sometimes Fatima would hear my voice calling her from downstairs, even though I was sitting outside her room. Sometimes Samina would hear her own deceased mother's voice: "Daughter, open the door. Stopping the bride's departure is bad luck." Sometimes the groom's voice would come from the gate: "Fatima, I have arrived. Everyone is waiting." But every time we called the real people, they were somewhere else. Whatever was standing outside the gate did not just want the door opened. It wanted Fatima to come to the threshold where a bride leaves her father's house. At one point during the night, I felt as if not earth but a fine trickle of water was coming in from under the gate. But when I went closer, it was not water. It was wet grave earth, crawling inside past the doorstep. I pushed it back with a broom, but within moments, it would come in again. From outside came the same voice: "Khalid, what will you do by stopping the happiness? The path of the promise also passes from inside the house." At that same moment, the door of Fatima's room shook violently from inside, as if someone had pulled it not from outside but from inside. Fatima screamed. Samina held her. When I reached upstairs, there were wet fingerprints on the inside of the window glass, not from the outside. And between those marks, a word seemed to be formed in the earth: share. Just before dawn, the final trick happened. There was no knock on the gate this time. Instead, the sound of a wedding procession began to be heard from inside the house itself. Drums, shahnai, women's songs, men's laughter, car horns, as if the entire procession had entered our courtyard. The relatives sitting downstairs stood up in panic, but the courtyard was empty. The sounds were coming from the walls. Then suddenly, all the sounds stopped, and a very close whisper came: "Khalid, if you will not give happiness, then give the color of happiness." At that moment, the color of Fatima's red bridal outfit began to turn black in one spot, as if someone had placed a hand of wet earth on it. Samina immediately tore off that dupatta and threw it on the floor. The cloth kept shrinking on its own for a few moments. Then the smell of an old grave rose from it. Samina wrapped Fatima in a plain white sheet and for the first time addressed not me but that thing itself, saying, "This is my daughter. She is not the goods of any promise." After that, such a silence fell over the house that we could hear our own heartbeats. Just before the call to morning prayer, there was one final knock on the gate. Only one. Then from outside came that same voice, this time more distant but heavier: "Not today, but the memory will remain." After that, everything fell silent. When I opened the gate after the first light of dawn had spread, there was no one outside. No wedding procession, no man with the red cloth, no footprints. Only directly in front of the gate, a small pit had formed in the wet earth, as if someone had placed grave soil there for a while and then taken it back. In that soil lay dry acacia leaves, and the corner of the red cloth that had been in the man's hand was half buried in it. The real wedding procession arrived after morning. Everyone was anxious, angry, embarrassed, and confused. We made an excuse that Fatima's health had suddenly deteriorated. The bride's departure did not happen that day. 3 days later, the wedding was quietly conducted during daylight hours from the house of Samina's brother. People still say that we stopped the wedding that night out of fear of bad luck. No one knows that we did not stop the wedding. We saved our daughter from a threshold where an old promise was standing. Samina took a long time to forgive me. Perhaps she has not completely forgiven me even today. She used to say, "Khalid, you were afraid of poverty, so you placed your child's happiness in front of the darkness." I could never answer this. We told Fatima the complete truth much later, but even before that she already understood something. For many months after her wedding, she kept having a dream that she was standing as a bride at a door. Someone outside the door would say, "The first step was mine." Slowly, those dreams became less frequent. But our house was never the same again. Within a few months, my business began to collapse. First, a fire broke out in one of my warehouses. Then a large order was canceled. Then debts started being called back. Then the factory closed down. People said it was the evil eye, that my fortune had turned. But I knew that whatever had been built after that night was now being taken back. The only difference was that this time the price was being taken from my wealth, not from my child. Today I run a small shop. The income is modest, but my sleep is better than before. My daughter is settled in her own home. Thank God. But the mention of her wedding night is still spoken in soft voices in our house. I am telling this story so that no man in his desperation turns his weakness into a gamble and gives his tongue to the darkness. A person thinks that a promise is just words, but some places hold onto words. What I learned from that night is this: there are doors that should never be opened, even when you are starving. There are promises that should never be made, even when you are drowning. And there are debts that do not appear in any register but are collected, without interest, without mercy, at the worst possible moment. For 22 years I carried that promise inside me. I thought I had outrun it. I thought success had washed it away. But the promise was not in my memory, it was in the ground. And the ground does not forget. That night when the entity stood at my gate and said, "Not today, but the memory will remain," I knew that the memory would remain forever. Not as a punishment from God, God is merciful. It was my own doing. I had opened a door that should have stayed closed, and what came through that door was not evil in the way we imagine. It was something far more terrifying, a contract that demanded its share. I no longer visit that cemetery. I no longer take shortcuts past it. When I hear of someone going to a shrine or a grave to ask for their fortune, I try to stop them. Some listen, some laugh, some walk away. But I know the memory remains. Samina and I grew old together. The fire of our love did not die, but a cold ash settled over it. She never looked at me the same way after she learned the truth. Sometimes, late at night, I would wake to find her sitting up in bed, staring at the window, whispering prayers. I do not know if she was praying for me or against the thing that had followed us. Fatima's children come to visit us sometimes. They are beautiful, innocent, full of laughter. When they run through the courtyard, I feel a happiness that almost makes me forget. Almost. But then, on some nights when the wind blows from the direction of the old cemetery, I smell wet earth. And I remember. I have told this story now. The burden is still there, but it is lighter. I pray that Allah accepts my repentance. I pray that He protects every father from making the mistake I made. I pray that He seals every door that should remain sealed. If you have made a promise in desperation, break it now. Break it with sincere repentance, with charity, with prayer. Do not wait for the debt collector to arrive at your daughter's wedding. Because when he comes, he will not ask for money. He will ask for the thing you love most. May Allah keep us all safe from such promises, such greed, such deeds, and such nights where a man risks his child's happiness to change his fortune. Amen. If you liked this story, Please like the video and leave a kind comment. Subscribe to the channel for more true stories of fear and faith. We will meet again, God willing, with another story.